2 psilocybin sessions. 2 sessions, not 2 years, not 200 pills, 2 sessions. And 5 years later, 60% of participants are still in remission from treatment-resistant depression. We don't have anything else that can do that. Not even close. I'm Clayton Nickus. I'm a licensed therapist and the country's first fully licensed natural medicine clinical facilitator. I'm a licensed psychedelic therapist who works primarily with psilocybin. Today, I want to walk you through what the research on psilocybin therapy actually shows. Not the hype, not the headlines, the data. What psilocybin does for depression, anxiety, addiction, end-of-life distress, and why these numbers are shifting fundamentally how we look at mental health healing. In a study out of Johns Hopkins, 2 psilocybin therapy sessions resulted in 71% of participants showing major symptom improvement, with 58% of people no longer meeting the diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder. But here's the number that really mattered. When those researchers followed up with those participants 5 years later, about 60% of them were still in remission, not improvement, not things were a little bit better, not they were less depressed. They did not qualify for a diagnosis of major depressive disorder anymore 5 years after 2 psilocybin sessions. The depression was gone. To put that into context, if you start an SSRI and it works, which it doesn't always, you're on it for a median of 5 years. And when you stop, the depression often comes back because the underlying cause was never addressed. You were managing the symptom, not resolving the cause or the root cause, the source. In a head-to-head comparison, psilocybin versus the SSRI acetaprolime, which you probably know as Lexapro, 2 psilocybin sessions were at least as effective as 6 weeks of daily antidepressant pills, but the psilocybin group reported fewer side effects and better overall quality of life. And unlike SSRIs, psilocybin doesn't need to be taken every day. It doesn't blunt your emotions and it doesn't produce sexual dysfunction. It doesn't have those gnarly side effects that SSRIs tend to have. If you've ever been on an SSRI, and I have, you know that this can be a major issue. When I was taking Zoloft, I had horrible side effects. I had erectile dysfunction. I had anal seepage. I couldn't feel any of my emotions. It was terrible, frankly. That might be a little TMI for some people, but those were the side effects that I genuinely experienced. For treatment-resistant depression, and these are people who haven't responded to conventional treatment like therapy or other SSRIs, psilocybin therapy appears to be roughly twice as effective as either medication or psychotherapy alone. And these aren't fringe studies from tiny universities or somebody conducting out of the basement of their home. These are major research institutions that are publishing these papers. Johns Hopkins, NYU, the Imperial College of London. They're top-tier peer-reviewed journals, and they've been replicated. The question about whether psychedelic therapy is legitimate and genuine is over. It clearly is. For generalized anxiety disorder, a single psilocybin session can produce significant reductions that last 6 months or longer. Compare that to benzodiazepine, such as Xanax or Klonopin, which lasts about 6 hours. It's not even comparable, not even close. Not to mention that psilocybin actually gets to the core of what's happening. That's the reason that it works. That's the reason that the effects are so durable, because it addresses what's underneath, what's actually happening inside of the system. It doesn't support avoidance. It doesn't support continued ongoing ignoring of the emotions or of the thoughts, of the behaviors that actually undergird that anxiety. It gets right to the core and assists you in making meaningful changes. For people with terminal illnesses, psilocybin therapy produced significant decreases in depression, anxiety, existential distress in about 80% of participants. 80% of people, 80%, these are people who are dying. These are people who have sometimes debilitating anxiety and fear about what it might mean to go through the sometimes painful process of death that they're going through. And even in these people, even in people facing perhaps the most challenging event of a person's lifetime, which is death, psilocybin helps alleviate that anxiety, helps bring acceptance, helps bring peace. We have pretty much nothing else in our toolbox as Americans that touches existential distress in this way. Very few things in the therapy toolbox, nothing in the medical toolbox. Traditional antidepressants don't address existential distress. Psychotherapy can sometimes help over long periods, but psilocybin-assisted therapy appears to get much deeper, much more quickly. It gets to the deep questions, the deep feelings about meaning, about purpose, about mortality. It helps even people who aren't dying, and I've seen this a lot, accept the truth of their life, whatever that looks like for them. Right now, actually in Colorado, we have one of the largest psilocybin trials happening at the University of Colorado Anschutz, where they're studying existential distress in cancer patients. So soon we're going to have even more information about this. And it's very reasonable to expect that psilocybin is going to deeply and meaningfully help these people, help people with cancer, help people who have come into a confrontation with one of the most challenging potentialities of this human existence. This study at Anschutz, it's the first of its kind that's funded by the National Cancer Institute. It represents large institutional investment in what we're doing in psilocybin research. We're just at the beginning of this. We already know a lot, but there's still so much to learn. Data on the efficacy for psilocybin-assisted therapy for addiction is still emerging, but what we have so far in the clinical research literature is pretty promising. There was a smoking cessation study out of Johns Hopkins where a single psilocybin session was given to participants. That one session was enough to have 80% of people quit smoking for a week, and 67% of those people were still smoke-free a full year later. We don't have anything else, again, that's even close to that. All of our smoking cessation interventions pale, really, in comparison to those numbers. For context, the best treatments that we have for smoking cessation right now have about a 30% success rate. So psilocybin more than doubles that. For alcohol use disorder, we have a study that showed participants who received psilocybin showed significantly fewer drinking days compared to placebo. I had a client, they sent me an email to celebrate being 7 months sober. So I've seen it in my practice, the efficacy of psilocybin for substance use, including alcohol, tobacco, and very likely other substances. The thing that makes psilocybin promising for addiction is the same thing that makes it promising for everything else. Addiction at its core is a pattern of avoidance, habituated, conditioned, repeated avoidance. It's using a substance to escape internal distress, to deal with what's happening inside, to cope, to run away. Psilocybin disrupts that rigid conditioned pattern. It helps underlying emotional content come to the surface, and it opens up the possibility of a different relationship with yourself. When you resolve what you've been running from, the need to run diminishes. The pleasure, the joy of being in relationship with reality, even though it might be painful initially, eventually comes to be much greater than the feeling of numbness that we get from running. And that's one of the ways that psilocybin can help with addiction. So everything that I've just described is measured in somewhat remote clinical terms, actually: symptom scales, diagnostic criteria, remission rates. And those numbers are impressive. Research is important. But to reduce this work only to the clinical data is to miss a massive part of what makes this work so beautiful and profound. There's a whole dimension of this work. There's a whole dimension of psychedelic therapy that doesn't really show up on clinical scales. A majority of participants in these studies rated their high-dose psilocybin experience as among the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their lives. What this means is these people are ranking their experiences right up alongside births of children and weddings and vacations, the most meaningful experiences of their lives. About 60% of people in psilocybin studies report what we call in research a mystical experience. The mystical experience is a feeling of unity, transcendence, sacredness. It's the sense that all of life is dripping with meaning, that everywhere you look there is divine importance, purpose, and meaning. And the effects aren't just subjective and fleeting. This isn't typically something that you just experience and then it goes away. It can last. It can linger in the system. And research has documented lasting increases in trait mindfulness, in openness to new experiences, in empathy and pro-social behavior, in intimacy, in relationship satisfaction, in overall life meaning. All of these things are measurable for months after somebody has a psilocybin-assisted therapy experience. What we have here with psilocybin therapy is something that treats clinical conditions better than pretty much everything else that we have right now, while also producing the well-being outcomes that the wellness industry, mindfulness, meditation, yoga, have been chasing. Psychedelic work is not a replacement for those practices. It's sort of an adjunct. It can support ongoing relationship with yourself, ongoing practice, discipline, commitment, focus. All of these things are important. In fact, psilocybin work and psychedelic work in general requires ongoing integration practices, ongoing relationship to yourself and the world. There's typically action or homework that the medicine experience asks you to adopt. And in that way, psilocybin is a catalyst to get people to where they might not get otherwise, to motivate, to inspire, to move along, for us to get on with the life that we're here to live. The truth of this is, though it's exciting, psilocybin is not for everybody. We know that, right? There are exclusion criteria. People with a personal or family history of schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders are probably not a good fit for psilocybin-assisted therapy. There are cardiac considerations for some people. If you've had heart stents, if you have high blood pressure, those are things that you might need to create a safety plan around. And in the Colorado regulated model, when I facilitate for clients, if there are heart conditions, they need to be reviewed by a medical practitioner so that we can understand the level of safety prior to continuing. Heart conditions don't mean that you're not a good fit. It just takes a little extra care, a little extra caution. There are also potential interactions with certain medications, primarily lithium. And so those are the people who are not necessarily a good fit for psilocybin work. And the field is young. We're still learning so much about this work that a lot of these studies are still pretty small. We're still learning about who benefits most, what the optimal protocols are, how to predict outcomes. We do have some theories about how these work, like the rebus theory, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, and the default mode network hypotheses. I talk about those in my other video. But by and large, the field of psychedelic science is still a mystery. There's still a lot that we have yet to understand, which is really exciting. It presents a massive opportunity for curious young researchers or practitioners to get involved in something that is genuinely a frontier of science, of knowledge, of understanding, and of practice. It is important to understand that psilocybin by itself is not a magic pill. The preparation, the support during the administration session, the integration, these are important factors that can't be removed from the experience. It's all of these things that come together to translate a powerful experience into lasting change. If you take a psychedelic at a party or at a festival, I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I think in the right environment, with the right people at the right time, with the right psychological and emotional framework, honestly, recreational psychedelic use can be safe. And most of the psychedelic use that's happened in the last hundreds of years has been what we might call recreational, personal use, ceremonial. I'm not of the opinion that clinical therapeutic use is the only valid way to work with these things. And an intention, a container, is really helpful. I think about it like this. When you take a psychedelic, you open yourself up to a flow of psychological, emotional information. And it can be a little bit like the hose is open and it's spraying all over the place. If you're out, if you don't have an intention, the water is just going everywhere. And that can be wonderful and fun. It's like a sprinkler party. Sprinkler parties can be a good time. But in a therapeutic context, in an intentional context, what you do is you lay down irrigation channels. You prepare the landscape so that when that water starts to flow, it goes to the crops of your heart, of your mind, of your relationship. It's just a different context, just a different way to use and to work with the same experience. So if the clinical results are so good, why isn't psilocybin available everywhere? Why isn't this already deeply embedded in our culture? Well, the answer to that is terrible legacy politics. It's a story about prohibition, racism, political manipulation, and a deliberate campaign to undo everything that we know about psychedelics. That's the next video. If you found this useful, please subscribe. Next, I'm going to tell you how psychedelics went from mainstream psychiatry, which is where they were in the 1950s and the mid-1960s, to Schedule I, where they live today, and how they're making a comeback. I'll include a story about a friend of mine who was a combat medic in Afghanistan and what happened when he got access to psychedelic therapy for his PTSD. I'm Clay. Thanks for watching.